Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Assessing and Diagnosing Abnormality. So in this chapter we're going to be talking about assessment tools, challenges in assessment, and diagnosis. So what are assessment tools? When we think of tools, we think of hammers and nails and things like that. And that's not exactly what we're talking about when we talk about psychological assessment tools, but these are what we use to measure psychological symptoms. So they're often questionnaires, interview guides. There's some physiological measures as well, but generally we like to use our questionnaires in psychology. So when we talk about assessment tools, there are two things that we need to think about. They're the validity, which is the accuracy of a test in assessing what it's supposed to measure. So if you're trying to look at somebody's level of depression, you want to give them a test that assesses depression and not one that assesses anxiety. You want to also make sure that it's reliable. This indicates consistency of assessment tools in measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. So for example, you want to make sure that if you give the person the test and then you give them the test again, that the responses will be similar or they will reflect changes in the symptom presentation. And we also want to make sure that there's standardization so that there's a standard method of administering a test. And this becomes very important because if people do and ask questions differently, you get different responses, and therefore measures are scored differently. This becomes important, for example, in like clinical trials where you're testing the efficacy of a certain medication, and you want to be able to measure change over time. And so if you have different people doing the scale differently, the change might be due to the way that people are doing the scale and not necessarily to the symptom change. This also prevents extraneous factors from affecting a person's response. So you want to make sure your questions are open-ended and neutral, not like, so you tell me you're feeling depressed, right? And so people are more apt to say yes versus tell me how you're feeling. And that is more neutral and open-ended. So there are different types of validity. I know this is again kind of going into the mathematical realm, which is what everybody loves, but there's content validity. So that means that the test assesses all important aspects of a phenomenon. So for example, going back to the depression example, there are physical symptoms of depression like problems eating and sleeping, and there are also problems with kind of the way people think, like feeling hopeless, feeling sad and down. So you want to make sure that all those, if you're testing depression, that all those aspects of depression are measured. Predictive validity tests the behavior it's supposed to measure. Sorry, the test predicts the behavior it's supposed to measure. So, for example, measures of suicidal ideation would want to be predictive of eventual suicide attempts, such that people, who would score high would be those who are most likely to make a future suicide attempt. So that those tests would help us in determine who is at most risk. The construct validity is what measures what it's supposed to measure and not something else. So that's the example I gave you before, so that the test is measuring depression and not anxiety. Concurrent validity is the test yields the same results as other measures of the same behavior, thought, or feeling. So if I have a measure of depression 1, it should have a strong correlation or relationship with a measure of depression 2, since they're both supposed to be measuring the same thing. And then there's face validity, in that the test appears to measure what it's supposed to be measuring. So again, using the depression example, questions would be like, are you feeling sad or down? Are you having problems sleeping? Rather than, do you like clown faces, which has nothing to do with depression. There are also different types of reliability for a questionnaire or test. Those of you who take psychometrics or test some measurements will learn a little bit more about this in greater detail. But we have test-retest validity, so that the test produces similar results when given at 2 points in time. Again, we would expect this from like an IQ test, because your IQ doesn't vary a lot across time. It's more of a stable construct. But something like depression, if you give it to somebody 2 years apart, if they're no longer feeling depressed, you might see changes. So retest validity depends on the stability of the construct. Alternate form validity, so that you have 2 versions of the same test producing similar results. So if you have the questions in different orders, you're going to get the same results. Interrater reliability, that 2 or more raters or judges who administer and score a test come to similar conclusions. So we often have people, evaluated by one or more than one person, especially when making high stakes decision. For example, the decision to civilly commit a sex offender. We often have 2 clinicians who evaluate the individual, but we'd want them to come to similar conclusions if they're doing tests in the same way. Internal reliability is that different parts of the same test produce similar results, and this is kind of a statistical measure to make sure that the questions are targeting a similar construct. So one of the things that we use in psychology is a clinical interview. And when we first meet a client, we do what's called a mental status exam, where we look at their appearance and behavior, their thought processes, their mood and affect, their intellectual functioning, and their orientation to person, place, and time. So this is kind of a general overview, gives us a sense if somebody, is suicidal, if they have a psychotic process, if, they're having dementia, etc., if they're very depressed. This isn't necessarily a diagnostic interview. Structured interviews, so this is more like, depending on the clinician, some of these can be structured in the sense that we have a guide, others can be not structured in the sense that we generally have, basic questions as psychologists that we ask to get a sense of a person. Structured interviews constitute a series of questions about symptoms experienced currently or in the past. And so there's a specific interview guide. All the questions are asked in similar manner. They're often, open-ended, or they have specific responses that are required, and so their concrete criteria are used to score a person's answer. Then we have symptom questionnaires, which cover a wide variety of symptoms representing several different disorders. So in my clinical work, I often use measures of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, because that's what I most commonly see among patients. But depending on people's disorder, I might give other symptom checklists. And these are good for me to get information about how my client are doing, the seriousness of their depressive symptoms, the seriousness of their anxiety symptoms, and also to see change across sessions. The Beck Depression Inventory is one of the most commonly used self-report measures. It's a self-report measure of depression that has 21 items. Each item is scored on a 4-point scale, 0 to 3, and scores range from 0, not depressed at all, to 63, incredibly depressed. So the BDI has been criticized for not clearly differentiating between the clinical symptom of depression and general distress. But since it's a symptom questionnaire, the goal really is not to provide a diagnosis, but rather to talk about the degree to which somebody is experiencing depression. So here are some sample questions from the Beck Depression Inventory. This is a question on happiness. I do not feel unhappy. I feel unhappy. I am unhappy. I am so unhappy that I can't stand it. So you can see somebody who is really, feeling very depressed with circle number 3 here. So changes in activity level. I've not experienced any change in activity level. I am somewhat more active than usual. I am somewhat less active than usual. I'm a lot more active than usual. I'm a lot less active than usual. I am not active most of the day. I am active all of the day. And so you can have positive or negative changes, although people with depression tend to have slowing and not increased behavior. Personality inventories, these are questionnaires that are designed to assess people's personality, like how neurotic they are, their typical ways of thinking, feeling, and behavior. So these are thought to measure more stable attributes of people's personalities rather than psychological symptoms that may change over time. The most well-known personality inventory is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This one is the most widely used, and why it's used a lot is because it's not face valid, meaning that the questions that you answer aren't necessarily very suggestive. It's not like, do you feel anxious? Some of the questions might be like, I like fast cars, I like the color red, and they're almost, I think, 500 questions on the MMPI. I could be slightly off with that, but what they did is they had like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people complete the MMPI, and then they looked at people's diagnoses, and they saw how people who have obsessive compulsive disorder answer the questions. They saw how people who tend to be more depressed, scored these. People who have more psychopathic tendencies, how do they answer these questions? And so they were able to figure out, kind of answer profiles, and therefore people who score similar ways have elevations on these different scales, and you can see the scales here. So there's hypochondriasis. These are concerns about bodily symptoms, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviant, masculinity, femininity, paranoia, psychasthenia, which is anxiety and obsessive behavior, schizophrenia, these are bizarre thoughts and disorders, hypomania, behavior found in mania, and social introversion, social anxiety, withdrawal, and over control. It also has validity scales, which is why people like to use the MMPI. So this detects people who are just randomly filling anything in. The test will be able to detect these inconsistencies. It also detects people who are trying to fake good, which is the lie scale. which means that sometimes people try to answer in a way that makes them look better than they really are. You see this a lot with people who are involved in the criminal justice system, and so therefore the lie scale would be elevated. The infrequency scale would be people who are trying to fake bad. So for some reason people have an investment in trying to appear sick, and therefore they might try to endorse very rare items like, like I see the world is covered in green slime, for example. It's kind of a rare item, and so people who are trying to fake bad might answer a lot of these kind of questions. And in the defensiveness scale, it's a tendency for a person to perceive themselves in a very positive manner. So if these scales are above the normal limits, it could render the profile of the person invalid, and therefore you can't interpret the MMPI. Behavioral observation is what it sounds like, the clinician's specific observations of a person's behavior and the antecedents and the consequences of his behavior. One of the advantages of behavioral observation is that you really don't rely on an individual's report and interpretation of their own behavior, but we do know that people, when they're being watched, tend to alter their behavior. For example, if you watch a child interact with another child to see what provokes him or her. When my kids go to Montessori school, we can sometimes observe them through the window, and they don't know that we're watching them, but they don't let us in the classroom because if a parent is in there, the kid will behave very differently. In psychology, especially in psychotherapy, we ask people to self-monitor a lot. And what self-monitor means is they keep logs of their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So keeping track of the number of times per day they engage in a specific behavior and in the conditions in which this behavior occurs. So if we're looking to decrease somebody's level of smoking, we would have them note how many cigarettes they're smoking per day, and we would hope that with intervention this would decrease over time. This is, however, open to biases in which individuals notice about their behavior and are willing to report. So hopefully people would be motivated to report honestly because they'd want to change these behaviors. But if you're, as I said, smoking a cigarette example. Intelligence tests. So many of you may have taken intelligence tests. There are some online, but they're not ones that we use. In psychology, we use the WAIS, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's been standardized and normed. But intelligence tests measure an individual's intellectual strengths and weaknesses. It can be used when mental retardation or brain damage is suspected, but it can also measure basic intellectual abilities like the ability for abstract reasoning, verbal fluency, spatial memory. They're used to determine if somebody is intellectually gifted. We'll talk a little bit more probably later on in the course about how intelligence tests are normed. But there's a lot of criticisms of intelligence tests because intelligence is kind of what people define, or the test defines intelligence to be. So, for example, in some communities or in some cultures, for example, being able to run fast is very, very important, or being a really good hunter-gatherer is very important to survival within that culture. Not so important in our culture. So our culture depends more on your ability to do things quickly, think quickly on your feet. And so there's a lot of, controversy as to what it means to be intelligent. Currently, the ways that we measure intelligence in North America are based on upper and middle class educated European Americans. And so there's a lot of controversy in applying these tests to people who are from lower socioeconomic status and from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And there's one standard deviation between scores between white and black individuals on the IQ test, and we know that obviously there's not one standard deviation difference in terms of intellectual functioning, so it's really an artifact of the test. Neuropsychological tests detect specific cognitive deficits such as memory problems, brain disorders. So if people have had a concussion or whatever and they're having some problems, they may have neuropsych tested to see if they can determine what specifically some of their deficits may be. One of the most known neuropsych tests is the Bender Gestalt. It's a very comprehensive test battery, and it assesses individual sensory motor skills by having them reproduce a sense of 9 drawings, and it differentiates people with brain damage from those who without. But it doesn't reliably identify the specific type of brain damage a person has. So you can see when people do the test that there's something wrong with them, but we don't know exactly what area of the brain is damaged. So you can see the stimuli are on the left, and then on the right would be the drawings of somebody who has brain damage, and you can see that they weren't able to accurately copy that. And by looking at that, you can see that there's something wrong with their ability to process spatial material. We also have brain imaging techniques. These are used when there's suspected kind of neurological damage. One of them is positron emission topography. There's also CT scans, which is an enhanced X-ray procedure. PET scans produce a picture of the activity in the brain. So you inject somebody with a harmless radioactive isotope and you can see which areas of the brain light up. You've probably seen these on TV before. So you can see that, for example, people with schizophrenia have activity in certain levels of the brain, like in the dopaminergic areas, and it could be indicative of schizophrenia. So SPECT is single photon emission computed tomography, and it's similar to the PET scan, except that a different tracer substance is injected. And then MRIs, you're probably all familiar when you kind of go inside that big scary machine. And then it images the brain at angles and provides finely detailed pictures more than like a CT scan. So MRIs can kind of produce 3D images and from different angles, and thus can see a lot more than a traditional CT scan says. Psychophysiological tests are used to detect changes in the brain and nervous system that reflect emotional and psychological changes. It's an alternative to the CT, PET, SPECT, and MRI. So one of these things is the EEG. So these are when you place electrodes on your brain and you can measure the electrical activity and the firing of specific neurons in the brain, and you have different patterns depending on, different ways of thinking and different reactions to different things. Projective testing comes out of the Freudian school of thought, and then and this is like the Rorschach, the ink blot test, where you have kind of neutral or ambiguous stimuli and you ask people to interpret what those things mean. They're usually in line with their current concerns or feelings, and the theory behind it is that people will project onto these ambiguous stimuli what they're currently feeling or thinking about their current emotions, their relationships with others, their conflicts or desires. It can be useful in uncovering unconscious issues of a person, or in cases where a person is resistant or heavily biasing the information they present to the assessor. There's a lot of controversy about the use of projective tests because of their validity and reliability is not as accurate as some of the other ones, but as I mentioned, the Rorschach is the most famous one. You've probably seen that before. The thematic appreciation test is there are different pictures and you have to say what's going on. There's also the draw a person, tree, and house, where you have people draw a person, a tree, and a house, and therefore you interpret things based on how big they make the hands and how big they make the eyes. As a cognitive behavioral psychologist, we don't use projective tests because we feel like the validity is questionable. However, they're still used quite extensively within the psychodynamic community and here in New York City. So some of the challenges of an assessment are the resistance and inability to provide information. So sometimes people don't want to share information for a variety of reasons, especially if you're working with offending populations. They don't want to get themselves in trouble. But also sometimes people have very poor insight into their motivations and for behaviors, or they may have brain damage and they can't provide you with information. It's also a challenge to evaluate children because kids have difficulty in communicating and reporting thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So oftentimes we have to rely on parents to help us with that, and teachers. It's also difficult to evaluate individuals across cultures because we may interpret their behaviors differently. We may have language barriers. And we also know that different cultures experience different psychological disorders differently. For example, while in North America, depressive disorders tend to be experienced more cognitively in that we have a tendency to, say, I'm feeling sad, I feel hopeless. In Asian cultures, there's a greater tendency to experience depression physically. So people will experience pain and, headaches and stomach aches, for example, when they're feeling depressed. So when we talk about psychological diagnosis, generally we are trying to determine if people have a certain syndrome, which is a set of symptoms that occur together. So these tend to co-occur within individuals. And based on these syndromes, we make a classification system. And so these are rules for determining whether an individual's symptoms are part of a greater symptom. So, syndromes are generally clusters of symptoms. So for example, symptoms of depression include depressed mood, loss of interest, weight loss, worthlessness, guilt, suicidal thoughts. Symptoms of anxiety include excessive worry, restlessness, irritability, and muscle tension. But both of these disorders overlap in a sense, and they both have symptoms of fatigue, sleep disturbance, and concentration problems. So you'll see that the symptoms on the left and the right are very distinct to the two disorders, but those in the middle can be a symptom of other different types of disorders. So Hippocrates was one of the first to kind of come up with a classification system, and he described mania as a state of abnormal excitement, melancholia as a state of abnormal depression, paranoia, epilepsy. And so you can see that already back in the day he was talking about a lot of the disorders that we talk about today. So mania for bipolar disorder, melancholia for depression, paranoia for schizophrenia, and epilepsy was probably more of a physiological disorder. So currently in North America, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM. And you'll hear me reference the DSM throughout this entire course because it's really the Bible of diagnosis for psychologists and psychiatrists. The first edition outlined the diagnostic criteria for mental disorders recognized at the time. We're currently in the 5th edition, and there have been many changes across the last 50 to 60 years. The initial edition, the criteria were very vague, and the descriptions were heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. They were very subjective and involved the diagnostician to make a lot of inferences. The DSM-2 was a revision of the DSM-1 and included more diseases. But it was really only when we got to the DSM-3, 3R, 4, 4R, text revision, and 5 that we really saw significant changes to the DSM. So the developers of these subsequent versions replaced vague descriptions of disorders with specific and concrete criteria for each disorder. Most of them were more objective in that they could be observed or measurable in some way. And the criteria were in the form of behaviors or experiences or feelings. The DSM-5, which is the current version and which your textbook is based upon, which is why unfortunately I only let you get the latest version of the text because the DSM-5 just came out last year, but it incorporates a continuum or dimensional perspective on mental disorders because many of us see that there's a very fine line between whether we have a disorder or whether we don't. So how did later and earlier editions of the DSM, not the DMS, differ? Specification of how long a person must show symptom of the disorder in order to be given a diagnosis. So, is 2 weeks enough, or should it be several months that a person exhibits these types of symptoms? The criteria for most disorders require that symptoms interfere with occupational or social functioning. So in the discussions, I saw that a lot of you talked about this, that it impairs people's ability to function in their daily lives. So what is the reliability of the DSM? Unfortunately, the reliability of diagnosis is relatively low due to a variety of factors, including the fact that the criteria are still vague and require clinicians to make inferences about people's individual symptoms, rely on individuals' willingness to report symptoms. So we still, as the DSM-5 is very new, we don't really have any data on the reliability of the DSM, but one of the reasons they made the revision was in order to increase the reliability of the psychological diagnosis. So the previous versions of the DSM had 5 axes that we were supposed to report on for each individual. The DSM-5 doesn't have that. Previously, Axis 1 were clinical disorders, Axis 2 were personality disorders and mental retardation, Axis 3 were anybody's general medical conditions, Axis 4 were psychosocial and environmental problems, and Axis 5 was a global assessment of functioning where everybody received a score on 1 to 100. So this is how I was trained. We gave people diagnoses on these 5 axes. But people had continuing concerns about the DSM-4 in terms of reifying diagnosis, whether it's a continuum or category, differentiating mental disorders from one another because there was a lot of overlap in symptoms, and addressing cultural issues. So there were also social psychological dangers of diagnosis in that our judgments and our biases and our labeling affected ways that we give diagnosis. So if we think about our own biases, this very much affected how we gave people's diagnosis. So people who don't have large social networks, who have problems coping, and who have major illnesses, all those things play together in terms of our